You are sitting in a room full of people who agree with you. The conversation is comfortable, familiar, predictable. Someone says something that confirms what everyone already believes, and heads begin to nod. Nobody looks nervous. Nobody looks challenged. Nobody suddenly goes quiet because a dangerous question has entered the room. Then imagine something different. Imagine someone raises a question that nobody expected. Not an insult, not an attack, just a question. A question so uncomfortable that the energy changes instantly. Faces tighten, voices become defensive, the atmosphere becomes tense, and suddenly you realize something strange. The strongest reaction in the room was not caused by hatred. It was caused by uncertainty. Because there is a difference between a question that threatens your opinion and a question that threatens your identity. Most people think they know the difference. Most people do not. That is where this entire discussion begins. Not with religion, not with belief, not with disbelief, but with something far more human. The fear of discovering that something we built our life around may not be as certain as we once thought. Think about the last time you felt emotionally attached to an idea. It could have been political, personal, moral, philosophical, religious. Maybe somebody challenged it. Maybe somebody pointed out a contradiction. Maybe somebody asked a question you could not immediately answer. What happened inside you during those few seconds? Did curiosity appear first, or did resistance appear first? Did you become interested in the possibility that you might learn something new, or did you immediately begin searching for reasons the other person must be wrong? This is where the uncomfortable argument begins, not with whether a belief is true, not with whether a belief is false, but with a far more disturbing possibility. What if human beings are often protecting emotional security more than they are pursuing truth? Before rejecting that idea, think about how often it happens outside religion. People stay in relationships they know are unhealthy because the alternative feels terrifying. People stay in careers they hate because uncertainty feels worse than dissatisfaction. People defend identities they secretly question because losing those identities feels like losing themselves. Human beings are not always driven by evidence. Human beings are often driven by emotional survival. And once you see that pattern, it becomes impossible not to notice it everywhere, including in conversations about ultimate questions. Imagine a person who has spent decades building an entire understanding of reality. Their friendships are connected to it. Their family is connected to it. Their sense of meaning is connected to it. Their understanding of life and death is connected to it. Their hopes are connected to it. Their fears are connected to it. Then someone introduces an argument that does not merely challenge a belief. It challenges the foundation underneath everything. Suddenly the discussion is no longer intellectual. It becomes deeply personal. Because if the foundation moves, everything above it moves too. This is why certain arguments create such powerful emotional reactions. Not necessarily because the arguments are correct, but because they force people to look at possibilities they would rather avoid. And here is the argument that many people struggle to hear. Not because it proves anything, not because it settles anything, but because it exposes something about human psychology. The argument is this: how much of what you believe is actually the result of where and when you were born? Sit with that question for a moment. Imagine you were born somewhere else, a different country, a different culture, a different family, a different language, a different tradition, a different understanding of reality. Would you still believe exactly what you believe now? Most people want to answer yes immediately, but think carefully. The overwhelming majority of human beings throughout history inherited their deepest convictions long before they had the ability to critically evaluate them. They learned them as children. They absorbed them from trusted adults. They repeated them before they fully understood them. They accepted them before they had alternatives to compare them against. Does that mean those beliefs are wrong? No. But it creates an uncomfortable question. If millions of sincere people throughout history have held completely different convictions with the same certainty, what exactly should certainty mean? If this question has ever crossed your mind, leave a comment. Not because there is a simple answer, but because many people experience this moment of doubt and rarely talk about it openly. What makes this question so difficult is that it attacks something deeper than logic. It attacks confidence. Because confidence feels meaningful. Confidence feels powerful. Confidence feels like evidence. Yet history repeatedly shows that confidence and correctness are not the same thing. Entire civilizations were confident about things that later turned out to be false. Entire generations were confident about assumptions that eventually collapsed. Human beings have always been capable of absolute certainty. That alone cannot tell us whether something is true. And this is where many people become uncomfortable, because the argument is not saying belief is false. The argument is asking whether certainty itself deserves the authority we often give it. Think about a child growing up. The child trusts the people around them. Of course they do. Trust is necessary. Without trust, learning would be impossible. But trust also creates vulnerability. A child does not independently investigate every claim. A child accepts what seems normal, what seems obvious, what everyone around them appears to know. Years later, that child becomes an adult and often mistakes familiarity for truth. Something feels true because it has always been present. Something feels undeniable because it has never been seriously questioned. Yet familiarity and truth are not identical. They only feel identical from the inside. Imagine waking up tomorrow in a completely different culture. Everyone around you believes something different. Everyone around you finds different ideas obvious. Everyone around you has stories, traditions, arguments, experiences, and convictions supporting their worldview. How would you know which assumptions belong to reality and which assumptions belong to your environment? Most people never seriously wrestle with that question. They answer it too quickly. They rush towards certainty because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. But what if uncertainty is not the enemy people think it is? What if uncertainty is actually where intellectual honesty begins? This is where the tension grows stronger, because many people secretly believe that questioning something means attacking it. Yet those are not the same thing. Questioning can be an act of hostility, but it can also be an act of sincerity. Sometimes people question because they want to destroy. Sometimes people question because they desperately want to understand. The problem is that from the outside, those motivations can look identical. A difficult question sounds threatening regardless of why it was asked, and that leads to another uncomfortable realization. Sometimes the strongest resistance to a question comes not from having an answer, but from fearing where the question might lead. Think about your own life, not religion, not philosophy, just life. Have you ever avoided looking too closely at something because you suspected the answer might force change? A relationship, a habit, a dream, a decision. Most people have, because knowledge carries consequences. Once you see something clearly, pretending not to see it becomes difficult. The same dynamic appears in conversations about meaning, existence, morality, purpose, and belief. Sometimes people are not afraid of being wrong. They are afraid of what being wrong would require them to do next. And that fear exists everywhere, among believers, among skeptics, among doubters, among atheists, among everyone, because at the deepest level, human beings are not merely protecting ideas. They are protecting identities. The reason this argument remains so powerful is that it forces a person to ask a question many spend years avoiding. If I had been born somewhere else, taught something else, surrounded by different assumptions and shaped by different experiences, would I still be convinced of what I am convinced of now? And if the answer is uncertain, what does that uncertainty mean? The interesting thing is that the question does not tell you what conclusion to reach. It does not prove belief. It does not disprove belief. It does something far more unsettling. It removes the illusion that certainty alone settles the issue. And once that illusion disappears, a much deeper journey begins. A journey into the uncomfortable reality that being human means living with incomplete information, competing narratives, emotional attachments, cognitive biases, existential fears, and an endless desire for meaning. Most people think the hardest challenge is finding answers, but sometimes the hardest challenge is learning how to live honestly with questions. And what makes this realization so powerful is that it changes the way you see everyone around you. Suddenly, people stop looking like enemies and start looking like fellow travelers trying to make sense of the same mystery from different directions. Yet there is another layer to this argument that makes it even harder to ignore. and it reaches directly into one of the deepest fears people rarely admit even to themselves. That realization is where this journey becomes far more personal than most people expect. Picture yourself lying awake at 3 in the morning. The room is silent, no conversations, no debates, no social pressure, no audience, just you and your thoughts. During the day, certainty often feels stronger because it is reinforced by routines, communities, habits, and familiar voices. But at night something strange happens. The mind becomes harder to distract. Questions that seemed settled begin to move again. Possibilities you normally keep locked away start knocking on the door. And perhaps the most unsettling realization of all begins to emerge. The greatest fear is often not that we might be wrong. The greatest fear is that we might never know. Most people spend their lives searching for certainty because uncertainty feels unbearable. We want answers about who we are, why we are here, what happens after death, whether suffering has meaning, whether justice ultimately exists, whether our lives matter beyond the brief years we spend on this planet. These are not small questions. They are the biggest questions a human being can ask. And because they are so important, many people feel an overwhelming need to arrive at conclusions that feel solid and permanent. Yet the argument many believers struggle to hear is not necessarily about the content of belief. It is about the psychological role belief can play. What if certainty sometimes functions less as a discovery and more as a shelter? Again, this is not a criticism. It is a human observation. Every person seeks shelter from something. Some seek shelter in relationships, some seek shelter in success, some seek shelter in money, some seek shelter in ideology, some seek shelter in science, some seek shelter in spirituality, some seek shelter in religion. The question is not whether people seek shelter. The question is whether they recognize when they are doing it. Imagine someone standing in the middle of a storm. The wind is violent. The rain is relentless. Fear surrounds them from every direction. Then they find a structure that provides protection. Naturally, they enter it. Naturally, they feel relief. Naturally, they become grateful for it. But imagine somebody asking a difficult question. Is the structure protecting you because it is true, or does it feel true because it is protecting you? Notice how uncomfortable that question becomes. Not because it has an obvious answer, but because it forces a distinction many people never make. Human beings frequently confuse emotional comfort with evidence. If something reduces anxiety, it feels trustworthy. If something creates stability, it feels reliable. If something gives purpose to suffering, it feels meaningful. Yet psychological usefulness and objective truth are not necessarily the same thing. A belief can be comforting and true. A belief can be comforting and false. A belief can be uncomfortable and true. A belief can be uncomfortable and false. The emotional effect alone cannot settle the matter. And this is where the conversation becomes deeply personal. Think back to a moment when life felt unfair. A moment when you lost someone. A moment when your plans collapsed. A moment when pain arrived without warning. In those moments, people desperately search for meaning. Not because they are irrational, because they are human. Meaning transforms suffering from chaos into narrative. Meaning gives pain a place to go. Meaning allows people to endure experiences that might otherwise destroy them. That search for meaning is one of the most powerful forces in human existence. But here is the uncomfortable possibility. The stronger the emotional need, the greater the temptation to accept answers before fully examining them. This does not only happen in religion, it happens everywhere. A lonely person may convince themselves somebody loves them because they desperately need it to be true. A fearful person may convince themselves danger is everywhere because it explains their anxiety. An ambitious person may convince themselves success will solve all their problems because they need something to pursue. Human beings often see reality through the lens of emotional necessity. And once you understand that tendency, you begin seeing a difficult tension. How do we separate what we hope is true from what actually is true? Perhaps the reason this argument generates such strong reactions is because nobody has a perfect answer. The believer struggles with it. The skeptic struggles with it. The philosopher struggles with it. The scientist struggles with it. Every human being carries desires, fears, attachments, and expectations that influence how they interpret reality. Nobody stands completely outside their own psychology. Nobody views existence from a perfectly neutral position. We all bring ourselves into the search, and that realization leads to another uncomfortable thought. What if the debate people think they are having is not the debate they are actually having? On the surface, arguments often appear to be about evidence, logic, doctrine, history, or philosophy. Beneath the surface, something else is happening. People are defending identities, protecting hopes, preserving narratives, avoiding fears, seeking belonging, searching for purpose, trying to make peace with mortality. In other words, they are wrestling with the deepest parts of being human. Consider how often discussions become emotional, even when nobody intended them to. A simple question can trigger frustration. A challenge can trigger defensiveness. A contradiction can trigger anger. Why? Because the discussion is rarely just intellectual. It touches the foundation of how people understand themselves. If you have ever experienced this conflict yourself, write your perspective below. Not whether you reached a conclusion, but whether you have ever felt the tension between wanting answers and fearing where those answers might lead. The reason this matters is because there is a hidden assumption many people carry without realizing it. They assume that if a belief provides meaning, then questioning it threatens meaning itself. But what if that assumption is mistaken? What if meaning is stronger than any single conclusion? What if the search itself contains value? Most people live as though certainty is the destination, and questions are obstacles. Yet some of the most profound moments in life emerge from questions. Questions create curiosity. Questions create growth. Questions create humility. Questions reveal limitations. Questions force people to confront themselves. A person who never questions anything may feel secure, but security is not necessarily the same thing as understanding. And here is where the argument becomes especially difficult, because it asks whether certainty sometimes closes doors that should remain open. Think about all the things humanity once considered obvious. The earth appeared stationary. The heavens appeared to move around us. Diseases seemed mysterious. Natural disasters seemed impossible to explain. Many assumptions felt undeniable because they matched human intuition, yet reality repeatedly surprised us. Again and again, certainty collapsed under closer examination. This historical pattern does not prove that any specific belief is wrong, but it does raise an important question. Why should our current certainty be immune to the same scrutiny? The uncomfortable answer is that it should not. Every idea deserves examination. Every assumption deserves reflection. Every conclusion deserves humility. Not because all conclusions are equally valid, but because human beings have a long history of overestimating their own certainty. And perhaps that is the real argument many people struggle to hear. Not that their beliefs are false, not that their convictions are meaningless, but that certainty itself may deserve less confidence than we often give it. The reason this idea feels threatening is because many people equate uncertainty with weakness. They imagine that admitting doubt means surrendering. They imagine that unanswered questions represent failure. Yet, what if the opposite is true? What if acknowledging uncertainty requires more courage than pretending certainty exists where it does not? Imagine standing at the edge of a vast ocean at night. You can only see a small distance ahead. Beyond that lies darkness. One response is to pretend the darkness is not there. Another response is to acknowledge its existence while continuing forward. The second response may feel less comfortable, but it may also be more honest. And honesty has a strange way of transforming people. Honest people become less arrogant, less defensive, less obsessed with winning arguments, more interested in understanding, more willing to listen, more capable of empathy. Because once you realize how much uncertainty exists within yourself, it becomes harder to mock uncertainty in others. Yet there remains one final layer to this entire discussion, a layer that goes beyond belief, skepticism, philosophy, and debate, a layer that reaches directly into the deepest fear beneath all the others. Because underneath the search for certainty, underneath the arguments, underneath the need for answers, there is a question so personal that many people spend their entire lives avoiding it. And once that question appears clearly, everything changes. The conversation stops being about what you believe and starts becoming about why you need to believe it in the first place. That is where the most uncomfortable realization of all begins to emerge. The question arrives quietly, not during a debate, not while reading a book, not while defending your position against somebody who disagrees with you. It arrives when there is nobody left to convince. It arrives during moments of silence, moments of loss, moments of fear, moments when life strips away distractions and leaves you alone with yourself. The question is simple, but its simplicity is exactly what makes it so difficult to escape. If you removed fear from the equation, what would you honestly believe? Sit with that for a moment. Not what you were taught to believe, not what your family believes, not what your community believes, not what your friends expect you to believe, not what feels safest, not what feels most comforting, not what protects you from uncertainty. What would remain if fear disappeared completely? The reason this question is so powerful is because it reaches beneath arguments and directly into motivation. Human beings often spend enormous amounts of energy discussing conclusions while avoiding the reasons they arrived at those conclusions in the first place. We examine beliefs, we defend beliefs, we criticize beliefs, but we rarely examine the emotional forces shaping those beliefs. Yet those forces may be more influential than we realize. Fear of death, fear of meaninglessness, fear of isolation, fear of being wrong, fear of uncertainty, fear of rejection, fear of disappointment, fear of losing hope. These fears are not signs of weakness. They are part of being human. Every person carries some version of them. The difference is that not everyone is willing to acknowledge how much power they have. Imagine two people standing on opposite sides of a philosophical argument. From a distance, they appear completely different. They disagree about almost everything. Their conclusions seem incompatible. Their worldviews seem irreconcilable. Yet if you look deeper, something surprising often appears. Both are searching for meaning. Both are trying to make sense of existence. Both are wrestling with uncertainty. Both are attempting to understand suffering. Both are confronting mortality. Both are trying to answer questions larger than themselves. Suddenly, the gap between them does not look quite as large. The conclusions may differ dramatically, but the human struggle underneath is remarkably similar. This is why the most uncomfortable argument is not really about religion at all. It is about the human condition. It is about whether people are as objective as they imagine themselves to be. It is about whether anyone can completely separate evidence from emotion, reason from desire, analysis from identity. And the honest answer may be that nobody can do so perfectly. We all carry invisible influences. We all have blind spots. We all have emotional investments. We all have narratives that shape how we interpret reality. Recognizing that fact does not weaken a person. It humanizes them. Yet there is another realization waiting beneath it, one even more unsettling. If certainty is not the ultimate measure of truth, then what is? Most people assume certainty should be the goal. They imagine that enough knowledge will eventually eliminate doubt. But look carefully at the people who have spent their lives seriously examining reality. Philosophers, scientists, historians, thinkers, explorers of every kind. The deeper they go, the more complexity they often discover. The more they learn, the more they become aware of what they do not know. Knowledge expands, but mystery expands with it. The horizon never stops moving. This does not mean truth does not exist. It means human access to truth may be more limited than we would like to admit, and perhaps that is the realization many people resist most strongly, not because it destroys meaning, because it destroys the illusion of complete control. Human beings crave certainty, partly because certainty feels like control. If we know exactly what reality is, we feel safer. If we know exactly how everything works, we feel secure. If we know exactly what comes next, anxiety loses some of its power. But life rarely offers that level of certainty. Relationships do not. Careers do not. Health does not. The future does not. Existence itself does not. We live surrounded by uncertainty whether we acknowledge it or not. The question is not whether uncertainty exists. The question is whether we are willing to face it honestly. This is where the psychological trap finally becomes visible. Many people believe they are defending a conclusion when they are actually defending protection from uncertainty. Again, this observation applies everywhere, not just religion. Some people cling to beliefs because they fear chaos. Others cling to skepticism because they fear vulnerability. Some fear faith, some fear doubt, some fear commitment, some fear ambiguity. Human beings often accuse others of being driven by emotion while remaining blind to their own emotional motivations. That blindness may be one of the most universal human traits of all. Think about how often people describe themselves as rational and describe opponents as emotional. Yet both sides frequently experience the same fears, the same attachments, and the same desire to be right. The difference is usually where those emotions are directed. This realization changes the way you see arguments. Suddenly, disagreements stop looking like battles between logic and irrationality. They start looking like collisions between different human needs, fears, experiences, and interpretations. And once you see that, something unexpected happens. Compassion becomes possible, not because everyone is correct, not because all ideas are equal, but because everyone is navigating the same uncertainty from a different angle. The believer, the skeptic, the doubter, the seeker. Each is trying to answer questions that no human being can completely escape. Why am I here? What matters? How should I live? What happens when life ends? How do I face suffering? How do I find meaning? These questions existed long before any of us arrived, and they will remain long after we are gone. That perspective creates humility, and humility may be the very thing missing from many conversations, because humility allows a person to hold convictions without becoming imprisoned by them. Humility allows confidence without arrogance. Humility allows questioning without cynicism. Humility allows belief without hostility. Humility allows doubt without despair. Perhaps the argument believers never want to hear is not that they are wrong. Perhaps it is that certainty itself deserves examination. But if we are honest, the same argument applies to everyone else as well. The skeptic who never questions skepticism, the atheist who never questions atheism, the philosopher who never questions philosophy, the critic who never questions criticism. The human tendency being exposed is universal. We all risk turning conclusions into identities. We all risk defending certainty because it feels safer than uncertainty. And maybe that is the deepest realization of all. The real conflict is not between believers and non-believers. It is between comfort and honesty, between certainty and humility, between the desire for answers and the courage to face questions that may never be fully resolved. That realization does not tell you what to believe. It does not tell you what conclusion to reach. It does not hand you a final answer. Instead, it leaves you with something far more difficult: responsibility. The responsibility to examine your own motivations, to question your own assumptions, to recognize your own fears, to distinguish between what you know, what you hope, what you suspect, and what you simply wish were true. Few people enjoy that process because it is uncomfortable. It strips away easy confidence, it removes the safety of simple narratives, it forces confrontation with uncertainty. Yet it also creates something rare: intellectual honesty. And perhaps that is the strange paradox hidden beneath this entire discussion. The moment you stop needing certainty at all costs may be the moment you become capable of pursuing truth more honestly than ever before. Not because you finally possess all the answers, but because you are no longer afraid of the questions. And that may be the most difficult argument any human being can hear. Not because it proves anything, but because it forces us to look directly at ourselves.